Today we're visiting one of America's most notorious prisons, a place where thousands were locked behind stone walls, where violence became routine, executions took place just steps away from prison cells, and where some people believe not everyone ever left. This is West Virginia Penitentiary. From brutal punishments and overcrowded cells to riots, murders, escapes, and some of the darkest stories in prison history, this massive Gothic prison has built a reputation that goes far beyond just being abandoned. But what is actually like to visit there today? Is it worth your time? Is it creepy? And how much of the prison's terrifying reputation is actually true? We're going inside the cells, exploring the execution areas, hearing the stories of inmates who lived and died here, including Charles Manson's mother, and finding out why this place continues to fascinate visitors decades after it closed. Before we explore the prison itself, you have to understand why this place even exists. When West Virginia became its own state during the Civil War in 1863, officials suddenly had a problem. They didn't have a state prison. So construction began here in 1866, and from the very beginning it wasn't exactly a happy place. The prison was designed to look intimidating. Massive stone walls, Gothic architecture, towers watching from above. Even today, it looks more like something from a horror movie than a correctional facility. And the really dark part is, much of the prison was built using inmate labor. Prisoners quarried stone, hauled materials, and literally built the walls that would eventually imprison them. Originally, this prison was designed for a few hundred inmates. That did not last. As decades passed, the population exploded. At times, more than 2,000 inmates were packed inside a prison designed for far less. Cells meant for one person sometimes held 3. Some inmates slept on the floor. Imagine living behind these walls with almost no privacy, overcrowding everywhere, violence constantly around you, and little hope of escape. And the architecture made everything feel worse. The narrow cell blocks, iron bars, stone walls, tiny cells, they weren't designed for comfort. They were designed to remind you every single day that you weren't free. As we walk through today, it's easy to admire the architecture, but it's much harder when you realize thousands of people lived and suffered inside these walls. So let's talk about some of the significant places in the prison. North Hall, or the Alamo as it was known, is the area that was reserved for the most dangerous and violent inmates. It was a cramped, 4-tiered block enclosed by chain-link fencing where inhabitants were locked inside tiny 5 by 7 foot cells for up to 24 hours a day. Rat Row was a block designated for rats or snitches. Inmates here had testified against their peers and required special protection from the general population. They were given a separate exercise yard to keep them safe from retaliation. Then you had Honor Hall, where inmates with good behavior were housed. These trustees enjoyed decreased security and were granted special privileges. The Sugar Shack was originally intended for recreation. This unsupervised basement space devolved into a lawless hub for gangs, drugs, and violent assaults. The execution area, or death house, was located in the North Yard. This was where the capital punishment was carried out. Nearly 100 men were executed here, first by hanging and later by electrocution in the chair known as Old Sparky. Now, Old Sparky was the grim nickname given to the custom-built oak electric chair used at the penitentiary. It was installed in 1951, and it replaced hanging as the state's sole method of capital punishment. It was actually built by an inmate. It was designed and constructed by an incarcerated man named Paul Glenn. So prior to 1951, the prison executed 85 men by hanging. The shift to electrocution occurred primarily because hangings were highly prone to human error, culminating in a horrific 1931 execution where a prisoner was accidentally decapitated. The state saw a more humane and controlled environment, leading to the creation of the electric chair, if you can believe that that's more humane. The death house location was where Old Sparky was housed. It was in a dedicated brick structure inside the prison's north yard, isolated from the general population blocks. So the use of the electric chair in West Virginia was a brief chapter in the state's legal history. Executions followed a strict legal and administrative protocol conducted within the dedicated facility. The device was designed to deliver a high-voltage electrical current, which served as the state's method for carrying out capital sentences during that era. It operated from 1951 to 1959, and there were 9 executions using Old Sparky. The chair's use actually ended in 1965 when West Virginia officially abolished capital punishment, making it one of the earlier states to do so. Today, the original Old Sparky chair is preserved as a historical artifact. It's on public display at the penitentiary here, where it serves as a focal point for historical tours and discussions. Forced labor was foundational to the structure and survival of the West Virginia Penitentiary. In fact, the very stone walls that kept the prisoners inside were built through their own hard labor, as I stated before. It took them 10 years of construction to complete the penitentiary. The institution operated under the Auburn system, which dictated that inmates be locked in solitary confinement at night but forced to work together in complete silence during the day. Inmates typically worked 9-hour shifts 6 days a week, performing grueling manual tasks. The overall factory was a major revenue driver where inmates sat in long rows of sewing machines, manufacturing overalls, uniforms, and textiles. They would also work in the brickyard and stone yard, where they mixed, molded, and fired bricks by the hundreds of thousands, which were used to expand the prison facilities and build local infrastructure. Industrial shops. The grounds housed a wagon shop, a carpentry shop, paint shop, tailor, bakery, shoe shop, and blacksmith forge. In 1921, the penitentiary expanded its forced labor operations underground by opening its own coal mine. It was located about a mile southeast of the main prison. A dedicated shaft was sunk 80 feet down to connect with the lucrative Pittsburgh coal vein. Inmates dug out the prison's entire energy supply, saving the state an estimated $14,000 a year. It was a massive sum at that time. They also had a massive agricultural wing. It started as a 10-acre plot next to the prison and expanded into a 200-plus acre farm known as Camp Fairchance. The inmates would clear fields, raise livestock, harvest fresh produce for the kitchens, and operate large-scale canning facilities to store vegetables for the winter. Only trusted inmates were permitted to work the farm and mine. They lived at the farm camp outside the main prison walls under the supervision of foremen rather than armed guards. To prevent escape, they were incentivized with good time allowance, earning an extra 7.5 days off their sentences for every month of hard labor. As I stated before, Charles Manson is connected to this prison. Now, he was never incarcerated here. However, his mother, Kathleen Maddox, was incarcerated here. In 1934, at just 16 years old, she ran away from home and became pregnant by a man named Colonel Walker Scott, who immediately abandoned her. When her son was born in Cincinnati, Ohio, she initially named him No Name Maddox on the birth certificate before changing it to Charles Miles Maddox. Now, the name Manson came from another man. She briefly married a dry cleaning laborer named William Eugene Manson, giving Charles the surname he would carry for the rest of his life. The marriage lasted less than 3 years due to her frequent partying and heavy drinking. In 1939, she was living a transient lifestyle, regularly going on drinking sprees and leaving 4-year-old Charles with various babysitters. Her life caught up with her on the evening of August 1st, 1939, in Charleston, West Virginia. She and her brother Luther met a man named Frank Martin at a local bar, and they lured him out of town, knocked him unconscious with a ketchup bottle, stole his wallet, which contained a mere $27, and stole his Packard convertible. They were quickly arrested, and Maddox was given a 5-year sentence for armed robbery, while her brother received 10 years. She served 3 years of her sentence at the West Virginia Penitentiary in Moundsville before being paroled in 1942, and this period was highly traumatic for young Charles. While living nearby in McMecken with his aunt and uncle, family members frequently forced young Charles to visit his mother inside the overcrowded, filthy prison. Charles would throw violent tantrums and scream every time he was dragged to the facility, deeply traumatized by the harsh environment. He later recalled that the first few weeks after his mother was paroled in 1942 were the happiest of his life, specifically remembering a hug from her as one of his only fond childhood memories. The fairy tale reunion quickly ended, and Maddox fell back into severe alcoholism, drifted between cheap motels, and was arrested again for grand larceny. Unable or unwilling to manage Charles, who was already skipping class, setting fires, and committing petty thefts, she attempted to place him in foster care before sending him to a strict Catholic reform school at age 12. That basically ended her custody of him, sending Manson down a lifelong spiral of juvenile halls and federal penitentiaries. She spent the rest of her life avoiding the public eye and died in Washington State in 1973. In 1983, Charles Manson sent a handwritten letter to the warden of the West Virginia Penitentiary in Moundsville, and he requested a transfer from his California prison. He wanted to be closer to his family in the region and promised to be a good worker. The warden famously rejected his request by saying it'll be a cold day in hell. Torture in this prison happened regularly. One of the most infamous punishment areas involved something called the kicking Jenny. Despite the almost harmless sounding name, there was nothing harmless about it. Prisoners would be strapped to a wooden frame while guards carried out whippings as punishment. They would be restrained while surrounded by guards, other inmates knowing what happened and having absolutely no control over what would come next. And solitary confinement was another form of torture that we hear about even nowadays. So for many inmates, this may have been worse than being physically beaten. Tiny spaces, isolation, and limited light, minimal human interaction. Some inmates spent long periods alone with almost nothing but silence and their own thoughts. Punishments could also involve restraint devices, like handcuffs, shackles, and confinement chairs. Methods designed to control prisoners, but often described by former inmates as physically and mentally exhausting. And remember, this prison was severely overcrowded, which meant punishments didn't happen in isolation. People would see them, and they heard them, they talked about them. Fear itself became part of the punishment. Speaking of people watching and seeing prisoners tortured, if you go back to when we were talking about hangings and how the hangings were replaced by electric chairs, well, when they did the hangings, a lot of times they were public hangings, and you could just bring the family around and watch someone be hanged. The public viewing of hangings came to a gruesome end on June 19, 1931. An inmate named Frank Heyer was sentenced to hang for the murder of his wife. Because of Heyer's heavier weight, the drop caused the rope to slice entirely through his neck, decapitating him instantly in front of the assembled crowd. The horrific incident effectively soured the public on attending executions. Following this incident, the state mandated that all future hangings be by invitation only, restricting witnesses to immediate officials, clergy, and select reporters. Now, just because the public couldn't view anymore didn't mean they didn't have more issues. So just 2 years after the Heyer disaster, the gallows failed again during the execution of a kidnapper named Orville Paul Adkins. As he stood on the trap door, the mechanism prematurely released before the executioner could secure the noose around his neck. He plunged straight through the hatch headfirst, smashing into the concrete floor below and suffering mortal injuries. Guards scrambled to drag the severely injured man back up the stairs to hang him a second time, minutes later, to officially complete the sentence. There were 36 documented homicides that took place directly inside the West Virginia Penitentiary, driven by a complete lack of guard supervision, rampant shiv weaponization, and intense retaliation among inmates. Now, let's talk about a few of those murders. So, we have the butchering of R.D. Wells. He was targeted by inmates because he was labeled a snitch. He was actually pretty generally a well-liked prisoner who worked as a maintenance clerk, but because of his job, he frequently interacted and chatted with the correctional officers. In the paranoia-fueled environment of this prison, this friendly behavior was misinterpreted by a group of newly transferred inmates. They labeled Wall a snitch or a rat, which was essentially a death sentence within the facility's walls. On October 8, 1929, 3 inmates targeted Wall while he was walking down to the basement boiler room, an area commonly referred to as the Hole, to pick up routine cleaning supplies. The attackers snuck down ahead of him and hid inside a dark basement bathroom stall, waiting for the perfect opportunity to strike. As Wall entered the area, the 3 inmates emerged and carried out a very long and violent assault using improvised weapons. The attack was characterized by extreme brutality, reflecting the volatile and lawless nature of the prison during that area. They used homemade shivs, and they basically stabbed him and ended up decapitating him. His murder served as a catalyst for major changes. Because of the extreme nature of the crime, it forced state authorities to confront the fact that the penitentiary was dangerously overcrowded and effectively it was unmanageable. The state government authorized a significant expansion of the facility later that year, doubling its size in an effort to improve safety and restore order. William Red Snyder was a high-profile inmate who was actually involved in the 1986 riot where there were hostages taken. And before the legal process could actually conclude, he was ambushed outside his cell block and killed by rival inmates in a premeditated attack. Today, Snyder's former 5'7" cell at the far end of the North Hall, which was the maximum security area, is the centerpiece of the facility's ghost tours. It's widely considered by tour guides and paranormal investigators to be the most active spot in the entire prison. Visitors frequently report hearing a deep, raspy, masculine voice whispering, sudden severe equipment and camera malfunctions when approaching this cell, or a heavy, oppressive feeling of being watched by a large shadow lingering near his place of death. The prison was notorious for driving men to the brink of madness. Inmates were locked in microscopic 5 by 7 foot cells, often jammed in with 2 other cellmates due to the extreme overcrowding that I mentioned. The complete lack of privacy, constant threat of gang violence, and terrifying conditions earned the prison the media moniker of Hell on Earth. For many, suicide became the only perceived escape from the endless torment. Historical logs show periods of extreme volatility. For instance, a 1971 investigative report highlighted that over a brief 3-year stretch alone, 5 inmates took their own lives alongside 6 who were murdered. While many individual suicide records are buried in old state archives, some are tied to highly publicized crimes. In December of 1941, an escaped prisoner who was being tight confinement. Unable to face the looming judicial execution or life in the brutal cell blocks, he committed suicide by hanging himself in his cell just 11 days later. Like the murder sites, the cells where inmates took their own lives are heavily emphasized on the ghost tours at the penitentiary. The psych ward was a designated psychiatric area and solitary unit where suicidal and mentally ill patients were often unproductively chained or isolated, and they're frequently cited by paranormal investigators as hotbeds for shadow figures. Cold spots, visitors and tour guides regularly report sudden localized drops in temperature and overwhelming feelings of sudden panic or dread when standing in specific cells where hangings occurred. More than 500 successful escapes occurred at the West Virginia Penitentiary between 1960 and 1995 alone. That exposes the severe security flaws within the crumbling facility. Despite the 5-foot deep foundations designed to prevent burrowing, prisoners used extreme violence, complex engineering, and sheer creativity to breach the walls. So, one of the escapes was the bloody mass breakout in November of 1979, where 15 inmates launched a coordinated breakout. They used a smuggled pistol to overpower the guards, seize additional service weapons, and flee past the front gate. Just outside the walls on a residential street, they crossed paths with off duty state trooper Philip S. Kesner. When Kesner tried to intervene, the prisoners dragged him from his car and shot him. Police captured most of the fugitives within days, but the mastermind, Ronald Turney Williams, evaded authorities for 18 months. He landed on the FBI's 10 most wanted list and killed another man in Arizona before being captured after a New York City shootout. The final breakout to make national news occurred on February 19th, 1992, and was called the Greenhouse Getaway. 3 convicted murderers, Tommy Mullihan, David Williams, and Fred Hamilton, managed to dig a 32-foot-long, 16-foot-deep tunnel right under the outer wall. They began the dig from inside a prison greenhouse and successfully emerged directly beneath an unarmed guard tower on the east side of the facility in broad daylight. All 3 were eventually recaptured, but not before Williams traveled south and held a family hostage at gunpoint in nearby New Martinsville. This high-profile security failure accelerated the political push to close the prison permanently. A few years prior to the greenhouse incident, the exact same trio of murderers pulled off a completely different escape. They broke into the basement of the old administration building and located a pair of bolt cutters in a maintenance locker. Slipping out a window, they hid behind a massive ventilation unit until the coast was clear, cut a hole directly through the chain-link fence on Jefferson Avenue, and vanished into a waiting vehicle. Inmates regularly tested the boundaries of the prison using any materials available to them. One story involves a hot air balloon. One creative inmate hand-stitched a makeshift hot air balloon out of prison mattress covers, hauled it to the roof of the industry building, and attempted to launch it. It failed to get airborne. Another inmate successfully escaped by burying himself deep inside a pile of rotting garbage inside the prison's outgoing trash truck. Inmates also successfully escaped over the years by commandeering a prison truck and by hiding inside a heavy commercial cement mixer. The embarrassment of these frequent breakouts, coupled with the 1986 riots, forced the West Virginia Supreme Court to label the prison unconstitutional, leading to its 1995 closure. So now we're going to talk about just some of the unique, interesting, maybe weird stories that are associated with West Virginia Penitentiary. So, one of the strangest relationships in prison history involved an inmate named Red and a dog that belonged to the prison guards. Red successfully escaped the prison guards and hid out in the heavily wooded hills surrounding Moundsville. The guards deployed their trusted prison tracking dog to sniff him out. The dog tracked Red perfectly, finding him deep in the woods. Instead of barking or attacking, the dog, who apparently liked Red more than the guards, sat down next to him. When the guards finally found them, Red was casually eating lunch, sharing his food with the dog and petting it like an old friend. So we talked about the electric chair, old Sparky, but there was an electric chair test run. The prison's infamous electric chair was built entirely by an inmate, which we talked about earlier, and because Glenn was a skilled electrician, the warden ordered him to build the execution device. Once construction was complete, the prison officials needed to test if the chair actually worked before a real execution. Glenn actually volunteered to be strapped into his own creation for the diagnostic wiring check. Fortunately for him, they tested the voltage levels without actually turning the lethal current on. Did you also know that West Virginia Penitentiary had an inmate baseball team? In the early 1900s, the prison had a fully functioning, highly competitive baseball team that played against local semi-pro teams from across West Virginia and Ohio. Games were played inside the prison yard. Thousands of outside citizens would buy tickets, walk through the prison gates, and sit in the stands alongside hundreds of inmates to watch the game. The team was highly successful because the inmates had a powerful motivation to play well. The warden promised them that if the team maintained a winning record and good behavior, no one on the roster would be executed or put into solitary confinement during the season. Yay! Because of the immense violence inside the prison, it gained a reputation as one of the most haunted places in America. The weirdest paranormal story involves the Shadow Man. For decades, both inmates and guards reported seeing a completely flat silhouette of a man walking the corridors of the North Hall. What makes it weird is that the entity wasn't just reported by superstitious inmates. Several strict, no nonsense prison guards put official statements into their daily shift logs, noting that they chased a dark shadow down a corridor only for it to vanish into a solid stone wall. Another strange story is how some of the guards were poisoned with mercury. The extreme violence inside the prison wasn't just inmate on inmate, the correctional officers were constantly targeted. In one of the most insidious assassination attempts inside the prison, a group of inmates managed to smuggle elemental mercury into the facility. Rather than using a shiv, the prisoners stealthily laced a guard's coffee with the toxic heavy metal. The guard survived, but the incident highlighted how little control staff had over what entered the kitchen and dining halls. The prison location itself is highly controversial and contributes significantly to its haunted lore. The prison sits directly across the street from the Grave Creek Mound, one of the largest Adena Native American burial mounds in the U.S. During the initial construction in the late 1860s, crews dug up portions of the surrounding earth, which many believe desecrated ancient tribal grounds and cursed the facility from day one. Things that were filmed here, because of its intact castle-like Gothic revival architecture, the closed prison has found a lucrative second life as a movie set. So you can see the prison featured prominently in movies like The Night of the Hunter, which is a 1955 movie, Fool's Parade, which is a 1971 movie with Jimmy Stewart, and the psychological thriller Out of the Furnace, a 2013 movie starring Christian Bale. While the original Prison Break was not filmed here, the reboot that started in June of 2025 uses the West Virginia Penitentiary as the primary filming location. It's a spin-off of Prison Break. Being here today, it's easy to get caught up in the ghost stories, the rumors, and the creepy reputation this place has built over the years. And walking these halls, it's not hard to understand why people feel something here. What makes this place truly disturbing isn't the paranormal stories, it's the very real history that happened behind these walls. For more than a century, thousands of people lived here, packed into tiny cells, surrounded by violence, isolation, overcrowding, and a system that often cared more about punishment than rehabilitation. These walls witnessed riots, executions, murders, escapes, suffering, and countless people who entered these gates never expecting the lives they would have. Today, visitors walk through the same cell blocks, stand in the cafeteria, see the recreation yards, and even walk past the execution areas. And while the prison is now silent, it doesn't exactly feel empty. Places like this can be uncomfortable to visit. They're supposed to be. Because beneath the ghost stories and in the dark tourism is something much bigger, a reminder of what happened here and the people who lived through it. So after seeing inside of one of America's most infamous prisons, what do you think? Would you visit the West Virginia Penitentiary, or is this one dark destination you're leaving off your list? And if you love dark history, abandoned places, and destinations with stories most people never hear, make sure to subscribe because we have a lot more to explore.